Okay, so let's start by taking a look at my layout. I'm right-handed, so I want my paper on the left, my palette here, water's over here, always have a paper towel handy, paint there, and again, this does kind of matter. You don't want to be reaching over where you're painting to get water or paint and then dripping it as you come back this way. So think about how you're oriented before you even start. Now what I'm going to do is first use two tubes of paint, and basically what I'm going to create is a neutral. It'll be a very dark neutral, but first of all I'm using my ultramarine blue, and you don't need very much of this, just a very small amount. And then I'm going to use sepia. Sepia, I think I might have mentioned, comes from a squid or cuttlefish. Squid ink, so to speak. And I'm using a fairly small brush, just something that, you know, might be easy for you to get a feel for. Round brush. Typically most people are going to use rounds much more than flats. So it's a good way to start. This is a nice palette, a good size. I prefer having as much palette space as possible. Take a little bit of, and it's good if you have 2 jars, as I mentioned, 2 jars or something like this that has 2 sides to it. Dirty, clean. Clean is for mixing. This is for cleaning the brush while you're painting. Okay? So I'm just going to take a little bit of water on my brush, create a little bit of liquid in there, and then we're going to go over here, put it here. What comes out of your tube is very, very concentrated. Very concentrated. And for people who have never used watercolor before, it's kind of a common mistake, but a big mistake to just kind of like scoop it up right out of the tube. Water is really your medium. There's a small amount of pigment suspended in it. And it's really important to remember that the more water you have, you know, the lighter it's going to be when it hits the paper. And generally you're always mixing with water. That water translates to the white of the paper. So you're always mixing with whatever you have on the palette. More water makes it lighter, because that means the pigment is going to be spread out in the water and you're going to see more of the paper. So the more water I add here, okay, the lighter it gets. So let's just make a little bit of a stroke here, right? Okay. Now, let's add a lot more water. Same mixture. And make the same basic stroke. And that's basically the difference between more water, less water. Okay? Okay, so I'm taking ultramarine blue and sepia. I'm mixing the two together to get a good amount of a very, very strong, dense, very dark neutral here. I'm going to mix several different neutrals going from light to dark with this. And I'm going to start just by taking a little bit, and this is what we had before. That's a good neutral. Looks almost black. Yeah, a good neutral is not going to look blue, it's not going to look brown or sepia. It's really going to look in between. So I'm going to take more water. Now all I've used in this dirty water is this neutral, so I'm not worrying about adding it. And I'm gonna make a very light mixture, and you can test it out here, see what it looks like as you go along. Add a little bit more water. Then next, I'm gonna kind of go up a step, make one a bit darker. And again, we're just putting paint here and then adding water. And so we should get something a little bit darker here. There you go. And lastly, let's take some of this pretty much as is. And let's just try moving the paint around a little bit to approximate a rectangle like that. Okay? Then again, we want to go one step lighter. Now what I want you to do this first time is when you make that lighter shade of the neutral, don't make another box, but don't touch one to the other. Because if you know anything about watercolor, wet on wet is a type of painting, and as soon as one overlaps the other, they do mix. So we're just going to do these first a little separately. Use a little bit more water. And do our next box like that. And make sure you're using plenty of paint so it's easy to move around. Easy to move around. Should be easy. Now we're going to make a very light gray. Using more water, more water, more water. Okay? And it's very hard to tell just looking on a palette value. These three look very similar, but on the paper they don't. So that's why a lot of times you do need to test things. And now I'm going to go one step lighter. And again, don't worry about making a perfect rectangle. It's more important just to keep the paint fluid. And the fluid, lots of water. Now, just as a test this first time, just to see what the paint does, okay? Do one scale of 4 grays, not touching. Now, do the next scale by letting them actually touch. And you could do this a little bit smaller if you want. We'll start off with the darkest one. Okay. Next we'll go with a step lighter and let them touch and see what happens. Now one thing I ought to point out, my marks are going to show whatever I do. I'm going to show a little bit more brush strokes in mine than you normally would. You're using cold press, I'm using hot press. Hot press tends to show every little thing that you do. Every little brush stroke, every subtle difference shows up. Okay, so we'll go another step lighter. And again, you can see a little bit of difference. This is drying pretty quick. We're not using a lot of paint. You can see right here one bleeding into the other just slightly. I am taking a little bit of time between each one to see if I can get them to keep some separateness. And that might be more difficult when you're doing it at home than watching me. Okay? So that's the second scale. Just with your neutral gray, mix out 3 grays, just focusing on value differences. Okay? Light to dark. Now the third time you do this, you're going to do something a little bit different. That is putting down your lightest gray first over the entire rectangle. So we're making a long rectangle and then putting the darks down on top of that. So the first thing that we're going to do, I'm going to add a little bit more water. I'm going to make one long rectangle here. You can see that's a little bit lighter. Now in this case, I'm not going to wait for it to dry. I'm going to go right into it and you'll see what happens. And I'm going to pick off right about here, and you can see how easily that paint spreads out. And you may not have much of an edge there. You may find that this bleeds into the light a bit. It depends on how long you wait in between grays. I'm going to go to my next gray here, right? And we're going to go from about halfway back towards dark. And you will see over time that division will kind of almost disappear, because we have just enough fluidity. The paper's still wet enough that one tone runs into the other. And now our darkest dark, need a little bit more, and we'll put this lastly there. Now you can tell, one of the things that maybe you can see right away is that these are pretty hard transitions. And again, with that second one that we did, where they're adjoining or touching each other, it really depends on how long it is between when you paint this and when you paint that. If you do it pretty quickly, they'll bleed into one another. If you give it a little bit of time, you might have this dry enough that you'll keep a pretty good division there. Here, where we're doing what's called wet on wet painting. Wet on wet painting, things flow pretty evenly. And you see the division between each gray pretty much disappearing.